"You're a stranger to the upriver country, are you not, Miss Wells?" he began. "I hope you like it here." Oh, yes," she said, "though I've seen little of your country yet. I suppose you come from up around Albany." Harmon shook his head. "No, I belong to the Claverack branch of the Van Rensselaers." He laughed as she looked blank. "All this must be confusing for you. Those across the table are the Fort Craylow Rensselaers from the upper manor. Some of them, that is. The man in black, seated beside the widow Mary Livingston, is Stephen Van Rensselaer, the present Patroon. Yonder is his son Stephen, and there are two of his daughters, Cornelia and Catherine. I've 7 sisters myself, but you won't have to try and identify them, for only 2 are here." She smiled. "I'm afraid I'm stupid about it. There do seem to be so many Livingstons and Van Rensselaers." "The gentleman on your right is neither, at any rate," said Harmon. "You know who he is, of course." Miranda stole a look at the heavy middle-aged man who sat beside her, gravely eating brandied eels in aspic. She shook her head. "Why, that's Fenimore Cooper, the author. He and his wife often come down from Cooperstown. They're visiting the Schuylers." "Oh, of course," said Miranda hastily, wishing she had had time to read The Last of the Mohicans, which Nicholas had recommended. When it came time to talk to Mr. Cooper, she found him taciturn. He seemed far more interested in the exotic creations which flowed unendingly from the kitchens than he did in her timid remarks. Until, in a desperate angling for conversation, Harmon being engaged with his left-hand neighbour, she brought forth something about the Kermis that morning and the farmers. Cooper immediately put down his fork. "Did Van Ryn have any trouble collecting his rents?" he asked, so sternly that Miranda was taken aback. "Why, yes, he did, in one case," she faltered. "Disgusting!" The author raised his hand and banged it down on the damask. Glasses tinkled and Miranda jumped. She had no idea what it was that the suddenly excited gentleman found so disgusting, but she soon found out. Mr. Cooper turned his back on her, and cutting peremptorily across the conversation at his end of the table, he addressed the Van Rensselaer Patroon. "This monstrous thing is spreading, Stephen. Van Ryn's having trouble, too." Everyone stopped eating and looked up, astonished. Stephen Van Rensselaer's placid face showed dismay, not so much at the news, which was no news to him, but at the introduction of an unpleasant subject amongst ladies at a social gathering. "I'm sorry to hear it," he said, and turned back to Mary Livingston, making some trivial remark about the weather. The good lady's forceful face beneath the white widow's cap expressed her perfect understanding of his tact, and she made haste to answer him as lightly. But Cooper would not be checked. Though there was not upon his own land any such system of tenantry, he had perhaps often regretted that there was not. He never forgot that his wife was a Delancey, once of Scarsdale Manor, and in any case his inclination and convictions had made him a thorough-going Tory. He turned vehemently to Nicholas, and all but shouted across the half-dozen people between them, "I suppose you know, Van Ryn, about Smith Boughton, this tuppenny little doctor who has moved to Columbia County and skulks about preaching rebellion and defiance of the law. By God, were I one of you landowners, I'd track down the rogue and string him up to the nearest tree." Nicholas also found this vehemence in poor taste, though he agreed with the sentiments. "No doubt you're right, sir, though I hardly think the fellow is of sufficient importance to trouble us. And after all, the law is entirely on our side. We need not resort to violence." "You may not, but they will. The lower classes are ever headstrong and stupid. They'll follow any leader who promises them change and power. They use no logic. And you need never expect gratitude, for you won't get it. If you'll not bestir yourselves, I'll do it for you, with my pen as a cudgel." Martin Van Buren stretched his plump legs and remarked, "There is indeed much unrest in the country today, but it'll pass, as all things pass. Van Ryn, I never saw a finer show of pinks. I swear they're as big as butter plates." He indicated the set floral piece on the table. "You must send your head gardener over to Lindenwald to instruct mine." "With the greatest pleasure," answered Nicholas, and the company, seizing upon the genteel and popular topic of horticulture, relaxed again into casual talk. The drawing-rooms had in their absence been cleared of furniture in readiness for the ball, so that after leaving the gentlemen to their port and liqueurs, the ladies gathered in the Red Room and the library. Seeing that Johanna was settling herself in the latter room, Miranda trailed along after the Van Rensselaer girls, who made for the Red Room. And at once upon crossing the threshold, she was conscious of the peculiar, penetrating chill which she had experienced on the first evening and never since. Again, she felt that formless uneasiness and oppression, the merest trickle at first, but bringing with it the sensation of mounting force as though flood waters were rushing through an ever-widening breach, not touching her yet, but she knew that when they did, she would be swamped with the remembered suffocating fear. So desperate was her desire to circumvent that moment that she broke violently into the conversation of the two ladies nearest her. "Isn't it awfully cold in here? I mean cold for July. I wonder if I should shut the window." Catherine Van Rensselaer from Fort Craylow stopped in mid-sentence and stared at Miranda. So did her cousin Harriet from Claverack. Both young women were handsome brunettes with a decided family resemblance. "I don't find it cold," said Harriet stiffly. "Rather on the contrary, and it seems to me that the windows are all shut." "Oh, yes, so they are," babbled Miranda, aware that she was talking nonsense but unable to stop, for the uneasiness was receding as she had hoped. "Perhaps it'll be warmer in the other rooms when the dancing starts." "Yes, surely it will be warmer when we start dancing." She drew a long sigh of relief. The sensation had vanished, and was replaced by the doubt that she had ever felt anything strange at all. She was left with the unpleasant realization of having made a fool of herself over nothing, and the quick blood flowed up under her sensitive skin. The ladies exchanged a look. The girl was either very silly or feverish or worse. Was it possible that she had had too much wine? With one accord, the two Misses Van Rensselaer drew in their billowing skirts. "Dancing is certainly most agreeable," said Catherine, with a vague smile in Miranda's direction. Then, having done her civil duty, she turned to her cousin and added, "Have you cards for the Downing soiree in Newburgh next week? I think we'll go, for Mr. Downing is most gentlemanly and gives delightful parties, for all that his origin isn't quite... "Yes, I know what you mean, love," said Harriet, "but after all he married a De Wint, and Mr. Downing's taste is so artistic, he has so much talent for architecture and landscaping, that I think we may consider him quite one of ourselves. Shall you be going to the Van Cortlands' ball?" Miranda, effectually silenced by this talk of people whom she did not know, listened a minute perforce because she did not know how to withdraw. But why did they shut her out? She longed so to be accepted on equal terms by all these people. She didn't want to nibble at their fringes. She wanted to be woven into them, stuff of their stuff. At last she escaped upstairs to her own room with a murmured excuse of repairing her dress, to which neither lady paid any attention. She walked at once to her mirror and consulted it mournfully. "I am pretty, aren't I?" she whispered, "and I am well dressed. What is wrong about me?" She soon learned. As she emerged from her room into the thick carpeted hallway, she heard the same two voices she had left in the Red Room. Catherine and Harriet, with several of the other ladies, had also gone upstairs to do a little necessary prinking. They were in one of the guest chambers, and the door was ajar. Miranda stood transfixed in the hall at the sound of her own name. "But who in the world is this Miss Wells?" asked a voice she did not recognize, to be answered by Harriet's well-bred laugh, tinged now with annoyance. "Nothing in the world but a sort of governess for Katrina. Johanna told me so." "Yet she seems ladylike, and Mr. Van Ryn introduced her as his cousin," persisted the first voice. "One of those poor unfortunate Gansevant relations, actually off a farm, I believe. Nicholas has befriended her. You know how clannish the Van Ryns are. He's trying to make something of her." "Your brother Harmon seems to find her attractive at any rate," said the other voice with a touch of malice. "Oh, Harmon likes a pretty face as well as the next man, but there's no danger of his getting involved when he knows her position. I can't think why she should be present tonight. Johanna thinks it most unsuitable. I'm sure my governess is never mingled with guests. The girl's manner is odd, too, shows her lack of breeding." Miranda leaned her hot cheek against the cool walnut paneling. The hateful snobs. It wasn't like that at all. She wasn't like that. And hard on the first angry impulse that had almost sent her dashing into the room to confront Harriet, came an even more disagreeable thought. They had said nothing that was not the literal truth. She was a farm girl and a poor relation. She was a sort of governess for Katrina. As for the odd manner and the lack of breeding, was that true too? A sick discouragement washed over her. She took 3 steps toward her own room. She would not go down to the ball. She would stay upstairs. No one would really miss her, even Nicholas. Johanna would be pleased. As for the others, if they thought about it at all, they would consider it most suitable. While she stood there irresolute, the musicians below, who had been tuning up, glided smoothly into the music she had learned for Nicholas. "I dreamt that I dwelt in marble halls," sang the violins. Miranda lifted her head and listened. It seemed to her to be a sign. "I won't go skulking back to my room," she thought. "I'm going down." She drew a deep breath, clutched her fan and her handkerchief tight, and descended the staircase just ahead of the other ladies, who came out in a bevy and abruptly stopped talking at the sight of her erect, defiant back. This defiance carried her through the evening. Let Johanna glare from her throne. Let the older ladies on the side chairs whisper and look at her if they wanted to. The gentlemen at least were kind. Hurren claimed her at once, and as she was naturally quick, she soon managed to do well enough in the polka and waltzes. She danced with Livingstons and Van Rensselaers, and she danced with John Van Buren, whose wife was ill at home. Though his ginger-colored whiskers tickled her forehead, she particularly enjoyed this dance because Mr. Van Buren told her at once that she had something of the grace of the young queen. He was sorry when her next partner claimed her, a sorrow not shared by Miranda, for her next partner was Nicholas. This was the moment for which she had been praying all evening. Dance after dance had gone by, and she had nearly given up hope that he would ask her. Indeed, now the Count had already approached her and began, "Mademoiselle, will you do me the honor?" when Nicholas came up to them. "You are already engaged to the Count for this dance, Miranda?" he asked. "Oh, no," she cried, with a vehemence most unflattering to the round little Frenchman. "No, indeed, Cousin Nicholas." The Count made a little face and smiled to himself, murmuring, "At any rate, I am in the discard." Aloud, he said, "I hope I may dance with Mademoiselle later, but now I shall console myself with Mademoiselle Van Rensselaer." He walked to one of the gilt chairs on the farther wall, where Harriet sat waiting dolefully for a partner. At least, thought Miranda swiftly, I don't lack for partners, even if my manners are odd and I do lack breeding. But this thought vanished, as all other thought vanished, when the orchestra began to play the Corrientes Waltz, and she found herself in Nicholas's arms. His gloved hand barely touched her rose satin waist. He held her even farther away from him than the prescribed 12 inches. But as they followed the sugary strains of the Corrientes, she was overwhelmed by his nearness. It was as though they were imprisoned together in a shimmering bubble, through which she could see the image of the drawing-rooms and the other dancers distorted and diminished. Nothing was of any importance but Nicholas and the closeness of their bodies. Her heart beat furiously. The hand which he held in his trembled. Her breath kept catching in her throat and starting with a sharp sigh. She rushed wildly into speech, babbling of the party, the music, telling him in incoherent detail of her earlier talk with Harmon Van Rensselaer. Suddenly, Nicholas cut across this flow. "Keep still, Miranda," he said curtly. He had not been looking at her. His dark, chiseled face was raised and his eyes fixed on some point far beyond her head. Now, as he spoke, he still did not look at her, but to the rebuke which dismayed her, he added 2 words: "My dear." At first she doubted that she had heard them right, afraid to hope that he had said those words not casually or impatiently, but with emphasis, giving them their full force of intimate endearment. But his hand tightened on hers, and she knew that she had indeed understood him. To the other dancers the waltz seemed interminable. The musicians, watching Nicholas and waiting for a sign, received none, and cleverly dovetailing Coriolanus' finale into its introduction, began again. The Count, bouncing around with Harriet and perspiring freely, for she was a well-set-up young lady considerably larger than he, watched Nicholas and Miranda from the tail of his eye and thought, "He is indiscreet, that young man. People will certainly begin to guess something. The girl's face is transparent as a piece of window-glass." But before Nicholas and Miranda had become really conspicuous, in fact at the very moment when Mrs. Stephen Van Rensselaer leaned toward the widow Mary Livingston and whispered behind her fan, "Were it anyone but Nicholas, one might almost think," the Count himself created a diversion. He had not meant to. His altruism and interest in the young couple would never have included physical discomfort for himself. It was sheer accident. His plump little legs had been tiring. His steps showed less and less of their habitual bounce until the orchestra, gathering speed for Coriolanus' second finale, infused him with new, desperate vim. He seized Harriet firmly around her shrinking waist and pirouetted magnificently into the reverse. One of his tight black pumps shot out from under him. His ankle twined itself around the leg of a nearby chair. The Count and Harriet crashed to the slippery parquet with mingled cries of pain and fright. Harriet was soon righted with the help of a dozen solicitous hands, and retired precipitately to repair alike her dignity and dress. But the Count lay on the floor, resisting all efforts to raise him with floods of hysterical French and a Gallic abandon of cries and groans. "Un médecin!" wailed the Countess, wringing her hands and fluttering around her prostrate husband. "Certainly, madame," agreed Nicholas. "Please calm yourself. I'm sending for a doctor. Count, I do think you'd be more comfortable off the floor, whatever the nature of your injury." 4 footmen slid the protesting Count onto a tabletop and bore him from the drawing-rooms, while Nicholas directed the procedure and then disappeared with his suffering guest. The others stood about for a moment, discussing the accident. Then the orchestra struck up a polka, and, true to their code of ignoring the unpleasant, they settled back into the proper ballroom decorum. Johanna, who had waddled a few steps toward the scene of the catastrophe, resumed her chair in the farther room, but she caught Miranda's eye and beckoned to her. Miranda obediently walked over to the gilded chair. "Go and wait in the hall for the doctor," ordered Johanna. "The servants are all upset, those who aren't amusing themselves below stairs. When the doctor comes, take him up to the Count." "Yes, ma'am," said Miranda. She perfectly understood that she was being banished from the dancing, but she did not care in the least. After that dance with Nicholas, everything else would be drab anticlimax. As it was, she preferred to be alone, to recreate each moment of the last half-hour, the moment he put his arm about her, the pressure of his hand, and the tone of his voice in those 2 low words, "My dear." The hall by the front door was dim and deserted. The sounds from the drawing-rooms were muted here. She sat in a carved black Gothic chair, her chin cupped in her hand, and waited. In 20 minutes there was the thud of galloping hoofs outside, a sharp whinny. Miranda opened the door, and a young man strode in. He was hatless, his grey homespun suit was wrinkled and smelled of horse lather. He was several inches taller than Miranda, but heavy-boned, so that he looked shorter than he was. He had a great deal of rather untidy sandy hair, a freckled face, and alertly humorous grey eyes. "You can't be the doctor," said Miranda, who had been prepared for a reproduction of Dr. Lynch at home. Silk hat, pointed beard, dignity, and maturity at least. The young man waved the shabby black bag which he clutched in his muscular fist. "I'm a doctor. Jeff Turner from Hudson. I was tending Tom Wilson's wife. I got word I was wanted here." He spoke in a quick, forthright voice. "Where's the patient?" he went on, examining Miranda coolly. "One of the fine gentlemen take too much wine? Or one of the elegant ladies get a fit of the vapors?" "Certainly not," she retorted, annoyed at the carelessly contemptuous look he cast at the sombre magnificence of the great hall. "One of our guests heard himself dancing, a French nobleman, the Count de Grenier." She had expected to impress him, and was sadly disappointed. Jeff Turner snorted. "No doubt an injury to a count hurts far worse than one to lesser mortals. You're Miss Van Ryn, I suppose, since you say our guests." Miranda blushed. Odious man. "Miss Van Ryn is 6 years old," she answered stiffly. "I'm Miranda Wells, the Patron's cousin." "Oh, to be sure," said Jeff. He paused and gave her a look of amusement tinged with pity. "I've heard about you." Miranda resented the look in its entirety. "I'm sure I don't know how you could have." She lifted her chin with a haughtiness she felt would have done credit to the widow Mary Livingston. To her fury, Jeff burst out laughing. "What a little goose you are," he said, not unkindly. "The humble people do occasionally dare to gossip about their superiors, you know. Now be a good girl and show me to the ailing count." Nicholas, as hospitality demanded, had remained at the count's bedside. He rose when Miranda and the doctor entered. The countess continued to pat her husband's pillow and give vent to little shrieks. Jeff did not greet the patron. He gently pushed aside the countess and made a swift, concentrated examination. "Sprained ankle, nothing more," he said, addressing no one in particular. "Bring me linen bandages." Nicholas gave a brief order to the hovering maid, then turned back to the bed. "Are you quite sure the leg isn't broken?" Jeff straightened up, and leaning against the ornately carved bedpost, answered quietly, "I'm quite sure, Mr. Van Ryn." The two men looked across the bed at each other for a moment of steady appraisal. At last Nicholas nodded, satisfied. "I've faith in your ability. I've heard about you from my bailiff. It's fortunate that you happen to be on my lands tonight." A hot rejoinder rose to Jeff's lips, but he checked it. Though he had never before met the patron, he had always despised him, considering him as a contemptible oppressor living in fantastic opulence, and denying to his tenants not only independence, but the simplest justice. Were it not that this sudden call to Dragonwyck had been represented as acute emergency, he would have angrily refused to come, because a tragic sequel to the rent ceremony this morning had still further inflamed him against Nicholas. But now, having met him, he found some of his hostility evaporating. For in that instant of mutual stock-taking, Jeff received an unexpected impression. Here is a lonely man, and a very unhappy one. While he deftly wound linen strips around the Count's swollen ankle, Jeff made the rejoinder that he had started to, but he made it without heat. "These would not be your lands if justice were done, Mr. Van Ryn." Miranda gasped and sent the young doctor an angry look, but Nicholas merely said, "Indeed? I'm sorry to hear you're an anti-renter." "Pour l'amour de Dieu!" cried the Count suddenly from his pillow, where he had been quiet during Jeff's ministrations. "Do not, I beg of you, have the argument over my bed. I am suffering, I am exhausted, and forgive me, monsieur, but this rent business I do not understand. I do not wish to understand it." Jeff grinned in spite of himself. "No, they do these things better in France, where they'd simply have a revolution and settle everything." He turned to Nicholas, and his eyes hardened. "But maybe your tenant farmers aren't so different from the French, Mr. Van Ryn. And maybe you're being a trifle melodramatic." answered Nicholas. "Come, doctor, this subject is boring my guest. If you've finished here, I hope you'll join me in a glass of wine downstairs." Jeff straightened his coat and snapped shut his black bag. "That would be charming, I'm sure, except that I'm busy. Tom Wilson's turned out of house and home this morning. Had an unfortunate accident with his scythe. It cut," said Jeff with cold emphasis, "the veins in both his wrists. I doubt he'll pull through." There was a pause. Nicholas's eyes flickered. "Didn't he get the money I told Dykeman to give him?" Jeff gave a brief laugh. "I believe he did, but 3 gold pieces don't necessarily prevent unfortunate accidents." Nicholas's mouth tightened. "I direct you to do everything possible to hasten Klaas's recovery. Spare no expense." Jeff walked to the door and turned on the threshold. "This is exceedingly kind of you," he said in an expressionless voice which deliberately mimicked Nicholas's last speech, "but I would do everything possible for Klaas without your gracious authorization." He made a dignified exit into the hall, thinking, "Lord, that was a bit pompous of me. It's my red-haired temper again." He descended the stairs ahead of Miranda and Nicholas, preparing to let himself unobtrusively out through the front door. He was a trifle ashamed of his rudeness, anxious to be gone from this oppressive palace, back to the farmers whose way of life he understood, and to whose cause he was passionately dedicated. But he reckoned without Nicholas, who walked swiftly round in front to bar the door, at the same time turning on Jeff the full force of his slow, rare smile. "I beg you to join me in one glass of wine before you go out again into the night. It'll give me very great pleasure." "Well," said Jeff to his own surprise, and found himself ushered into the library. He was puzzled by the intensity of will that he felt behind his host's natural-enough invitation. He disliked the arrogance and ruthlessness which emanated from Nicholas in almost tangible waves. He disliked the luxuriant elegance of the Patron's dress, the white rose in his buttonhole, and yet he did not quite dislike the man himself. For Jeff was a good doctor, shrewd and intuitive, and he felt beneath the complex picture which Nicholas presented to the world a quality which one could not diagnose, a divergence from the norm, a cleavage which inspired a faint, uncomfortable pity. This impression wore off after Jeff had galloped 2 miles through the warm July night and once more entered Klaas Baker's grey farmhouse. Klaas lay semi-conscious on the corn-husk bed, his arms swathed in blood-soaked rags, his face as pale as the whitewashed walls behind him, while his wife, sobbing hopelessly, crouched on the floor amongst a huddle of chairs, tables, and carpet-bags. The household goods which had been gathered for the eviction on the morrow. Chapter 6. For the rest of the summer there was great activity at Dragonwyck, a constant stream of guests with entertainment for them from morning until midnight. There were musicales and soirees. There were elaborate charades played in the rose gardens by the light of flares and twinkling paper lanterns. There were picnics and boating parties on the Hudson. There were even swimming parties, though these were popular with no one but Nicholas, who was an expert swimmer, having learned the art abroad in the waters of the Mediterranean. Very few of his guests could swim, nor did they share with their host the pagan triumph of mastering the elements. Much tormented Miranda these days. Since the night of the ball he had avoided her. Worse than that, he had ceased to champion her against Johanna, and without his backing Miranda found that she had insensibly slipped into precisely the position which that lady desired. She met few of the guests, and then very briefly. She was included in the entertainment only on the rare occasions when Katrina was. She now took most of her meals with the little girl in the schoolroom. That this was a reasonable adjustment and exactly the type of life which she and her parents had expected for her at Dragonwyck did not prevent her from lapsing into a dull misery. It had been so different at first when, though she had seen little of Nicholas, his attitude had been interested and personal. Only two things sustained her: the intuitive certainty that he was not as unaware as he appeared, and his remembrance of her birthday. She had become 19 on September 13th, and upon returning to her room at noon after teaching Katrina, she had found upon the table a single large rose, ivory white with a golden centre, and beneath it a book, Twice Told Tales, by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Inside the book there was a note. "The flower is like you. The stories may interest you. Both convey my esteem on this memorable occasion. N.V.R." On a day in early October, the Van Ryns and their house guests of the moment, the Bakemans and Phillipses, were invited to dine with the Van Rensselaers at the manor house in Claverack. Miranda, who had of course not been included in the invitation, disconsolately watched their departure from the window in the upstairs hall. On impulse, she went downstairs, moving with a frightened quietness because the deserted house seemed full of whispering shadows. The door to the basement stairs led off from the pantry behind the dining room, and she had never before used it. The family, except of course for Katrina, never penetrated into the subworld. The stairs ended in the servants' hall, and a dozen faces gaped at her in astonishment. Tompkins, in shirt-sleeves and with a foaming mug in his hand, half rose and then sat down again. "What can I do for you, miss?" he said resentfully. I wanted to see Zélie, please." The butler shrugged. "In the corner of the far kitchen, as usual." He pointed, having no intention except under Nicholas's eye of putting himself out for this little nonentity. Miranda passed through 2 kitchens lined with cook-stoves, ovens, and shelves full of gleaming copper pans. In a farther room there was a fireplace. Over the hickory logs a spitted pig rotated slowly, while a small boy turned the crank. In a corner by this fireplace sat old Zélie, rocking. Across the room, by a spinning-wheel, sat a placid Dutchwoman, also rocking. This was Annetje, the head cook, and on her capacious lap she held Katrina, while she sang to the child an old Dutch lullaby. "Trippa-troppa-tron, yes, the varken in de boon, yes." The purring flames, the homely smell of roasting meat, the motherly voice singing, and the 2 women rocking, sent a pang to Miranda's heart. No wonder the child preferred it down here. She smiled at Katrina, who smiled back sleepily, but did not move. Zélie raised her wrinkled face, and her chair stilled. "You want me, petite?" It was a statement, not a question. She motioned to a hassock beside her, and the girl obediently sat down. Across the room the foolish little song began again, more softly. "Trippa-troppa-tron, yes." "What do you want with me?" said Zélie. "You no listen." She shook her head sadly. "Azilda will laugh. I told you before." "Oh, don't start that again, please," cried Miranda, exasperated. "I didn't come down to hear that claptrap. I don't know why I came. I guess I was sort of lonely." "Lonely!" Zélie spat the word out. "You not knowing what lonely is yet. Why you not go home where you belong?" Miranda's eyes dropped. She clasped her hands tight on her lap. Home, yes, back to Abigail and safety, back to the coziness of fire like this. But never to see Nicholas again, to abandon all hope that someday, somehow... Further than this she never went. There was neither reason nor possibility in that formless hope. Zélie watched the girl's downcast face, and she gave a sharp, grim laugh. "The devil reads your soul. When you want a thing so much, it make that thing happen, sure. Always, if we want thing bad enough, it happen." Miranda shook her head. "That's nonsense, Zélie." The old woman stiffened. She jerked forward, her glittering eyes angry and threatening. But as quickly as it came, her anger passed. She sighed and slumped back. She fell to rocking again. The kitchen was quiet, except for the hissing noises made by the hot grease on the fire. Katrina slipped off the cook's lap. Clutching her doll, she stole over to Zélie and laid her hand coaxingly on the bony old knee. "Tell a story about the old times, Zélie," she begged. "Tell about Azilda. Miranda'd like to hear, too. Wouldn't you, Miranda?" The girl started. "Why, yes, I suppose so," she said unenthusiastically. She was no longer curious about Azilda, who seemed to be connected with nothing but superstitious fear and disaster. But the prospect of leaving the warm kitchen, and even this tepid companionship for the silence of the great house upstairs, was less inviting. "The Patroon don't like that I tell about Azilda," said Zélie. "It make him afraid." "How ridiculous," said Miranda, smiling. "He's not afraid of anything." "Ah!" Zélie sighed with a weary patience. "How the young are blind. Everyone is afraid of something, petite. Yes, I think I tell you the story. Listen well." She was silent for several minutes, and then she began to speak in a flat, chanting voice, as though she repeated words learned by heart long ago. "Marie Azilda de la Corbeille was most beautiful girl in New Orleans. Always she's singing and laughing and lighting flames in the heart with her so big, so soft black eyes." While Zélie talked, Miranda at first listened absently, finding the high inflected speech hard to follow. But gradually, as the old voice went on, it evoked a hypnotic power. Azilda grew real, and Miranda forgot that she was hearing of a girl who lived in an unknown city 100 years ago, or that Zélie was recounting a tragedy which she knew only at second hand, through her mother's stories, the black Titine, who had been Azilda's body servant. Azilda had loved a handsome Creole youth, aide to the Marquis de Vaudreuil, and there had been many a stolen meeting beside the fountain in the de la Corbeille's palm-fringed courtyard, behind their house on Royal Street. Until Peter Van Ryn came to New Orleans on an October day in 1752. He had come on his own brig to buy a cargo of Louisiana indigo, which he could sell at immense profit in New York. Theoretically, the French colonials were forbidden to sell produce to any but the mother country. Still, there were ways of getting around that. Peter's flat blue eyes, his square stolidity, above all his cold persistency, unrelieved by a single smile of conventional compliment, disconcerted the gay colonials. He got his indigo, and he got Azilda, too. "You mean he fell in love with her?" asked Miranda eagerly. Zélie hunched her shoulders. "There was no love in the Patron. He wanted her. He proved to her parents he was rich man, great lord. He took her with only a tiny dough. They think they make fine bargain." Even Titine had never known what exactly happened on the long, stormy voyage to the north. But she had seen her mistress transformed overnight into a faded little wraith, whose dark eyes now held but two expressions, a glassy blankness which changed when her husband was near to bewildered terror. There were no more songs or laughter. Day after day, through the harsh, snowbound winter, Azilda crouched beside a tiny fireplace, her hair no longer powdered, its curls strained back under the Dutch matron's white cap, her delicate body shivering under the shapeless black dress. The next autumn, Adrian was born. The Patroon had been momentarily pleased with his wife for having produced the requisite heir. In all other matters, she had sorely disappointed him. The beauty and gaiety which had first attracted him had not survived her outward metamorphosis into lady of the manor and Dutch housewife. But he overlooked her shortcomings upon the birth of Adrian, presented her with a diamond necklace and the little harpsichord which stood in the red parlour. Azilda never wore the necklace. After the baby's birth, even the Patroon could not fail to see that it was not Azilda's body alone that shrank from him. Her spirit had retired into a misty, far-off land from which she never tried to return. "All day she sit and stare out the window," said Célie. "She no answer when people speak. Only sometimes she go down to Red Room and play on the harpsichord when the Patroon is out. Always she play a little Creole song she learn as a child. The Patroon hate that. It make him savage. Then one day—" Miranda leaned forward. "Do go on, Célie," she urged. The old woman nodded slowly. "One day a disaster happened. The Patroon's ship went on the reefs. All the hands were lost and all the cargo. Titine was sitting with Azilda, trying to make her look at her baby, when the Patroon come roaring in like a bull. He grab Azilda by the shoulders and shake her. 'You won't understand, you witless thing,' he shout at her, 'but I am ruined.' At first Azilda just stare at him. Then, very softly, she start to laugh. Titine say the sound make her hair creep. The Patroon's hands drop. He back away. 'Why are you laughing?' he whisper. And she answer him for the first time in months. 'Because,' she say, still laughing, 'misfortune has come to this house of hatred. Always I will laugh at that.'" Zélie's chanting voice stopped abruptly. In the fireplace, one of the hickory logs fell apart, and a shower of sparks flew into the kitchen. Miranda drew a deep breath. What a horrible thing for her to say. She was crazy then, poor thing. "Crazy with fear and misery, petite. A tropic flower cannot live without sun. A soul cannot live without love." "But she had her baby," protested Miranda. "Yes, but it was too late. The madness had come. 1 week after the Patroon tell her about the ship, she creep downstairs in the night. She play her little Creole tune, and she laugh to herself. Titine heard. She come running to Red Room, but not in time. Azilda had taken knife from dining room drawer." Zélie raised her hand and made an eloquent gesture toward her throat. Miranda swallowed, staring at the grim old face. "And still she laugh," said Zélie calmly in her ordinary voice, "when badness come to Dragonwick. Only those of her blood can hear, but sometimes others feel warning, though they cannot hear her. I have felt, and you too, I think." The girl was silent. For a moment she almost believed, as she thought of the 2 occasions on which she had battled the nameless mounting fear, but since then she had sat a score of times in the Red Room with no eerie sensations at all. and both her common sense and her reverence for Nicholas, who had expressed the greatest scorn for Zélie's superstition, decided her. "That's a shocking story," she said, feeling reasonable and mature, "but it all happened a long time ago. One should forget old tragedies. I quite agree with Mr. Van Ryn that the story shouldn't be repeated." Zélie, apparently not listening, pulled a clay pipe and a nubbin of tobacco from her pocket. She thrust a broom straw into the fire, and lighting the pipe, shut her wrinkled eyelids while she inhaled a mouthful of smoke. Discomforted and annoyed, Miranda got up. She should never have encouraged the daft old thing in the first place. She walked over to Katrina, who was now playing with a litter of kittens in the corner behind the spinning wheel. "Let's go upstairs, dear," she said, "and I'll read to you." The child shook her head mutinously. "I want to stay here. Annette's making me a gingerbread man." There was nothing for Miranda to do but retrace her way through the kitchens and the hall full of servants, alone. In her absence, all the tapers had been lighted. The house was no longer dark and threatening. It was filled with the scent of flowers mingled with the aromatic smoke of the cedarwood fires. She walked through the downstairs rooms, her head high in a mood of defiance. It seemed to her that they all welcomed her. The gilded and carved furnishings, the moss-thick carpets, the marble statues, the porcelains from China and Dresden, the tapestries and brocade draperies, all the intoxicating perfume of luxury. "I do belong here," she thought angrily. "I'm Nicholas's cousin. How dare that old hag try to frighten me away?" She came at last to the Red Room. It was as quiet and fragrant as the others, except that, as usual, its smallness and the warm crimson of its curtains made it cozier. She walked to the harpsichord and threw back its cover. She hesitated, then quickly touched one of the yellowed keys. A thin, tinkling note responded. Her heart beat faster, and she waited. Nothing happened. No queer sensations, no warning chill, nothing. And I never had any either, she thought. So much for Zélie. Chapter 7. The river froze early that year, and with the cessation of the regular boats, guests too ceased coming to Dragonwyck. That Nicholas had used the distraction of entertaining this continual horde of guests for a purpose of his own, Miranda had no idea. But now, in November, with no one but the Van Ryns and herself in residence, she was suddenly much happier. Nicholas was aware of her again. It was as though he had held her in abeyance during those summer weeks, but he had not apparently abandoned all interest in her, as she had sometimes feared. Though no overt word was spoken, she felt that their relationship again approached that of the night of the 4th of July ball. On a Tuesday morning in the middle of November, Magda rapped on Miranda's door. "Mevrouw wishes to see you in her room," snapped the maid. "At once," she added harshly, as the girl started for the bureau to smooth her hair and shake down the immaculate ruffles at the wrists of her blue morning gown. Somewhat troubled, Miranda followed the maid down the hall. She had never before been summoned to Johanna's bedroom. The lady of the manor lay in the ancestral Van Ryn bed. Like the rent chair, it had come from Holland with the first Patroon, and on its headboard were carved the 3 leopards amidst elaborate design of bosses and leaves. Anyone else would have been dwarfed by the 4 colossal oaken posts and the scarlet and gold tester which they supported, but Johanna's unrestrained flesh overflowed most of the mattress. This room was gracefully proportioned and very large, but it gave no impression of space, for it was cluttered with a heterogeneous collection of shabby furniture brought by Johanna from Albany. And despite the maid's constant efforts, all the little tables were littered with half-eaten boxes of bonbons, torn clippings from magazines, and crumbs of colored wax. Johanna had lately taken an indolent interest in making the wax flower pieces which had become so fashionable. Though outside the front windows dazzling sunshine sparkled on the partly frozen river, brown plush portieres were still tight drawn, and the room had a sour, airless smell. "If this were only my room," thought Miranda, who had examined everything in one quick glance, "how beautiful I would make it. It would be the loveliest room in the house." Johanna's expression of vague peevishness hardened as she surveyed the girl. Against the vivid blue of Miranda's dress, the carefully arranged ringlets shone brightly gold. Johanna's resentful gaze lingered on the tiny waist, which Miranda's new stays pinched down to 18 inches. "Such tight lacing can't be good for you," she said sharply. "It's not suitable to your station, nor is the way you wear your hair. It should be confined neatly in a net." A slow wave of rose washed up to the fluffy curls on Miranda's forehead. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said with difficulty. Is that what you wanted to speak to me about?" "No, I'm not satisfied with Katrina's progress. You don't pay enough attention to the child." "I try to, ma'am," returned the girl unhappily. "Well, I want you to take her into Hudson today. She has a whitlow on her finger. Let Dr. Hamilton on Diamond Street treat it." Miranda was bitterly disappointed. She had been looking forward to this day. 2 nights ago at dinner, Nicholas had said suddenly, "Miranda, do you skate?" "Oh, yes, indeed, I love it," she had answered, thinking of happy winter outings on Dumpling Pond at home. He had nodded, his brilliant eyes on her eager face. "The creek behind Bronc Island is well frozen. On Tuesday, if the weather holds, we'll cross the river and skate." This was Tuesday, and the weather had held clear and sharp in spite of bright sunshine. There would have been the joy of exercise. Her muscles often rebelled against the ladylike inactivity which was now expected of her. And then she would have been alone with Nicholas. "I don't think it's a whitlow, ma'am," she protested. "Trina had a splinter that I took out. You can hardly see the place now." Johanna pursed her mouth. "Magda says it's a whitlow. Besides, the child must go to the cobbler's on Union Street and have her Sunday boots mended. And here's a list of things which you may get for me in the town." She held out a scrawled piece of paper. "You will go at once." "And where is Miranda to go at once?" Both women jumped. Nicholas stood in the doorway, on his mouth an inquiring smile. He ignored Miranda, fixing his gaze on his wife. Johanna's pasty face disintegrated into shapelessness. She moistened her lips. You startled me, Nicholas. You so seldom come in here." He inclined his head and continued to wait for his answer. Johanna, with a nervous motion, pulled her bed jacket tight across her great breasts, straightened her crumpled nightcap. "Miranda must take Katrina to Hudson today. The child needs a doctor," she said at last. His eyebrows arched. "Could a doctor not come here, as usual?" "It would take too long. Besides, there are other commissions in Hudson." She added on a defiant note, "I ordered the carriage. It's waiting now." Nicholas inclined his head again. "I see. The trip to Hudson is very important. Miranda and Katrina must certainly go. It changes my plans a trifle, but no matter. I've been meaning to talk with the county sheriff for some time. Your wishes are always paramount with me, my dear, as you know." Johanna drew a labored breath. "What do you mean?" "Why, that I shall of course accompany them to Hudson," said Nicholas gently. "They could hardly get back before nightfall, and with the temper of the farmers what it is, the roads are unsafe. The Livingston coach was waylaid last week." Miranda could not suppress a delighted glance at Nicholas, but he still ignored her, his unwinking gaze on Johanna's face, over which now passed an expression of helpless bewilderment. and something else. Can it be that she's frightened? Thought Miranda in amazement. Nicholas was always so courteous, just as he had been now, and it was quite true that he usually did as Johanna wished, especially in these last months. What a fool she is, thought the girl impatiently, and forgot Johanna, whose wishes were negligible now that Nicholas had taken hold of the situation. That November day in Hudson was to be one of those vivid days, which comes seldom and unannounced, when every slightest incident is gilded with emotion. Of the dark undercurrents beneath that glowing day she had no conception then, nor for many years. It was enough that from the moment Nicholas seated himself beside her in the closed barouche, she should feel for the first time with him at ease, excited, adventurous, and beautiful. She wore the green silk, into which she had sewn a fresh ruching of cream lace. Over this, for warmth, went a wadded fawn-coloured pelisse, and her gloves and reticule were lemon yellow. Though she had few occasions to wear it, she knew how becoming the green bonnet was with its satin ribbons and ostrich plumes. Her handkerchief was perfumed with heliotrope, and the seductive yet delicate scent added to her sense of confidence. By noon they reached the Dugway Road, and pulled up the sharp hill on 2nd Street into Hudson. "How pretty the town is!" cried Miranda. She would on that day have thought a collection of squatters' huts on a mud-flat pretty. But the little town did have charm. Its neat houses were of brick or fieldstone and plainly showed their New England origin. Hudson had been settled by Nantucket Quakers, who sought, after the Revolution, a newer and safer whaling port. And though encircled by land-loving Dutch farmers, the Folgers and Macy's and Coffins had been profitably going down to the sea in ships for 50 years. "Where's Diamond Street?" asked Miranda. "Cousin Johanna said that Dr. Hamilton lived there, for Katrina's finger." Nicholas shook his head. "Hamilton's an old fogey. He knows no remedies but calomel bark and brandy. Take the child to that young Turner. He seems very capable." "But he's so rude, and he's a down-renner," cried Miranda, startled into protest by the aversion she had felt to the brusque young doctor. "All the more reason to flatter him with my patronage," answered Nicholas easily. "He'll soon lose his silly views if I make him the manor physician." "Oh," she said, "I see." How clever Nicholas was. He gave the coachman instructions, turned back to her. "I'm going to see Mayor Curtis and the sheriff. There's been more trouble in collecting the rents. I'll order this ridiculous business settled once and for all. Then I'll meet you at the Hudson house at 2. He got out of the carriage, stood hat in hand until the horse started. She watched his tall figure, made even taller by the high beaver hat, walk rapidly down the street. People stared, whispering. Once he uncovered his head and bowed to an old lady in gray, and his wavy hair shone black in the sunlight. The carriage turned down Union Street, and she could no longer see him. It stopped at a low brick cottage on Front Street near the river. A tin sign nailed on the whitewashed door said, "Jefferson Turner, M.D." Miranda sighed. "Come, Katrina, this is the doctor's." The child, hugging Christabel, obediently followed. As Miranda lifted the brass knocker, she was astonished to hear a confusion of voices from inside, and a male one louder than the rest, shouting, "Blast 'em! 'Tis no time for half measures, I tell ye!" Miranda's knock produced a dead silence. Someone said, "Hush." She waited 5 impatient minutes before the door was opened by Jeff himself. His sandy hair was tousled, his shirt-sleeves rolled up, disclosing heavily muscled arms with freckles and red hairs on them. The girl's lip curled. She drew up her green skirts and lifted her chin. "Miss Van Ryn has a sore finger," she said haughtily, putting her hand on Katrina's shoulder. "The Patroon desires that you look at it." Jeff continued to stare. His sharp grey eyes looked past the two on his step to the waiting Van Ryn barouche with the coat of arms blazoned on its door. He looked again at the annoyed girl. Then he threw back his head and emitted a guffaw. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Come in, madam. I'm most extraordinarily honored." Miranda threw him a furious glance and swept past him. The cottage had but 4 small rooms besides the kitchen at the back. The front room and surgery were full of men, a dozen at least, and one weeping woman who hastily wiped her eyes when she saw Miranda. "Look what I found at my door," cried Jeff, still chuckling. "Miss Van Ryn, no less." He made a sweeping bow to the bewildered Katrina, who put her finger in her mouth and clung to Miranda's skirts. "And," continued Jeff with even greater impressiveness, "the exquisite Miss Wells. She, too, is tinged with royalty, folks, for she is the Patroon's cousin." A murmur ran round the room. A small, slight man with mouse-colored whiskers pulled at Jeff's arm and whispered something. The woman stood up, her threadbare grey shawl falling off her thin shoulders. "I," she said bitterly, "the Van Ryns can mince in silks and velvets, while I and my children go hungry." She sidled past Miranda, who stood her ground, her heart beating fast. The woman went out of the front door.